Hello. In this video, I'd like to expand a little bit on the subject of point binding within DataHub WebView. As you may remember from an earlier video, my colleague Ken Collins introduced the topic of dynamic point binding. This was introduced with DataHub WebView 1.4, and it allows us to dynamically reassign the point binding of a control based on another selection within the interface. What I'd like to do in this video is introduce you to a third kind of point binding, which is being able to change the point binding of a control based on the output from a DataHub WebView script. Now, before we get to that, what I'd like to do is just quickly review the first two types of point binding we have within WebView. On the page you'll see we have a circular gauge control and a combo box control. If we look at the circular gauge, you can see that its point value is currently being bound to a DataHub WebView point called DataPid PID1 SP. This is the original kind of point binding within WebView, and it works quite well, but as we say, it's kind of a static binding. If you want to change which data point is being displayed through this control, you have to come in and physically change the hard coding of that control. Now, as you may remember from Ken's video, creating a dynamic point binding is actually quite straightforward. And if I go into run mode, I can show you that what I want to do is I have a combo box with three DataPid variables here, and based on which of these I select, I want to change the point binding for this gauge so that it shows whichever one I've selected from the combo box. So basically what we're saying is that when I select a point in the combo box, I want to rebind the control gauge or the circular gauge to the selected value of this combo box. So to save myself a little typing later, I'm going to right click and choose copy reference for the combo box. Then I'm going to come to the circular gauge, and as you may remember, the way we define a dynamic point binding within WebView is we come to the point binding field and we start with an equal sign, and then typically we use the getP function to get the property of a specific reference point. So if I do Control V, I can paste in the property that I'm interested in, the selected value of my combo box. And you can see here that we've done a syntax check and we're okay, and the output of this function when it runs is going to give us DataPid PID1 PV. So now if I click return or press return, then this gauge has now been dynamically reassigned to whichever value is being selected in the combo box. And we can see that if we come here, change to MV, then we change our value, change to SP. So those are the first two types of point binding. We have a direct binding, and then we have this dynamic point binding. Now let's go and open up another page and take a look at this changing point bindings through a DataHub WebView script. On this page you'll see I've got a few more controls, but in essence it's quite straightforward. I've got a list box with the names of these three gauges. I have a blue gauge, I have a control called green gauge, and a third control called yellow gauge. And the idea behind this, let me just show you it in run mode and then we'll come back and explain how it works. The idea is that I pick which gauge I want to focus on. I choose the new point value that I want to assign to it, and then I click on the set button, and that set button runs a script which changes the point bindings of this particular control to meet the point name that we've selected in the combo box. So if I choose the green gauge and say that I want that to be SP, then that script has run and it has reassigned the point bindings for the green gauge to be SP. Okay, so let's go have a look at how this is all working. First off, our list box. This is where we choose the name of the gauge. To configure a list box, it's very much similar to the way we configure a combo box. And what we've got here is a script binding, and the script binding is simply an array. I've defined an array of 3 words, 3 strings, blue gauge, green gauge, and yellow gauge. So this is going to give us the gauges that we want to focus on. If I take a look at the combo box, what you can see is in this script, to define or to get the variables that I want, I could have hard coded them as the variable names in the same way we did for the list box. But a much easier way of doing it is to use a WebView function called getPointNames, and then I'm using a query method of a regular expression. So in effect what I'm doing is I'm using a regular expression to collect all of the point names within WebView that, and my regular expression reads like this. The caret sign means that I want to collect all point names that start with DataPID :PID1, and then they have 1, 2, 3 more characters, and then it terminates. So it's going to ignore anything that has PID1 and more than 3 characters, and it's only going to pick things that start with DataPID PID1. Now if we go into run mode and just take a look at that, we've seen that what that does is it populates my combo box with just the variables within the system that match DataPID PID1 and then 1, 2, 3 characters after that. So that's how we've set up our list box and our combo box. Now the real fun starts when we look at what we've got assigned to this set button. What we've got is just a simple button, and in there on the onClick event we have a script, a WebView script, and it's quite straightforward actually. The first thing we're doing is we are creating a variable called gauge, which is equal to the property of the myListBox selected value. So we have a variable called gauge, which will either be green gauge, or blue gauge, green gauge, or yellow gauge. And in a similar way, we're creating another variable called PT, which takes the selected value from the combo box. So it's going to have the name of our point. Then what we're doing is we are creating a variable called P, which is a reference to the value of the gauge that we selected. So it's using this page function to pull a reference to the value of, in this case, the blue gauge. What that allows us to do is to then set the point binding expression for the value. We're changing, or we're setting it to a binding type of point, and we're giving it the point name that we selected from the combo box. Now when we assign a point, a new point name, or we change a point name, we then have to reset or redefine the binding type as well. So these two things kind of go in concert. We set a binding expression to be the new point name, and we set the binding type to be a point type, as opposed to a simple binding or a script binding. And that's it. Basically, when this function runs, it looks for the gauge we selected and the point we want, and then it assigns the new point to the binding type, or to the binding expression. The rest of this function is just some cosmetic stuff that I did to get a reference to the static text. That's this text here, which is the floating or static text for this control. So what I did is I got a reference to that, and I'm setting the binding expression again to the point we chose in the combo box, resetting the binding type to be a point type, and this time what we're doing is we're defining the data point attribute to be the name of the data point. Rather, in this case we didn't specify anything, so by default we bind to the point value. In this case what I wanted to do was bind this text to the point name. So that's why when we come to this and when the function runs, it changes the gauge to be displaying the value, and we take the point attribute of the value and bind the floating text property of this gauge to the point name that we're binding to now. So quite straightforward really, and quite a simple script on this set button to collect some information and then force a change in binding expression on a particular gauge, on a particular control. Now, just to complete things, I'll show you we have another button here which clears binding expression, and that was just simply a cosmetic thing I put on just so I could show you. The function that's associated with this clear button is actually quite straightforward. Again, it's on the onClick event, and what we're doing is we're just simply getting whichever gauge we're talking about from a selection list, and then I'm getting a reference to its value, and I'm just setting the binding type to none and its value to null and the static text to null. So that's how we're clearing this. So that's just showing you how we can affect the binding of a control through the output of a script. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to drop us a line. We're happy to talk through it. There's also a lot more information on this in the new DataHub WebView scripting manual that's available through the Cogent DataHub website.